twin sons of Varelles hung low over the crimson dunes, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to swallow whole regiments whole. Dust storms swirled like restless spirits across the ruins of what had once been Outpost Theta, now little more than shattered durasteel and the ghosts of fallen soldiers. Among the wreckage, a lone human warrior trudged forward, boots crunching over scorched sand and spent shell casings. His name was Torin Vale, and he was not supposed to be alive. The 7th Terran Expeditionary Force had been wiped out 3 days prior, caught in a surprise ambush by the Krellian Dominion during the final brutal push of the Varelian War. Yet here he was, half-starved, bleeding from a gash across his ribs, dragging 2 unconscious figures behind him on a salvaged hover sled cobbled together from enemy wreckage. And those 2 figures, blue-skinned, white-haired, clad in tattered royal armor, were Princesses Lyria and Silva, twin daughters of Empress Nerissa of the Siltheri Dominion. No one had seen the princesses since the disastrous Battle of the Glass Wastes. Imperial High Command had declared them missing, presumed dead. Their mother, the Empress, had spent the last 6 months cloaked in mourning, her court draped in silver veils of grief, her once commanding voice reduced to whispers. The war had ended 3 weeks ago with a brutal truce, brokered more from exhaustion than goodwill, and still no word of the princesses had come, until now. Torin had found them by sheer accident, buried beneath the collapsed roof of an underground command bunker, half dead from dehydration and radiation burns after the bunker's shielding failed during the orbital bombardment. He'd been scavenging for water when he heard a faint tapping, rhythmically, desperately, coming from beneath the rubble. What he'd expected to be a trapped comrade turned out to be something far more impossible. He'd recognized them instantly. Every soldier in the Terran Coalition had seen their images during briefings. The Siltheri royal twins, famed not just for their strategic brilliance but for their uncanny synchronization in battle. Lyria, the elder by 3 heartbeats, wielded a plasmacimeter with lethal grace. Silva, quieter but no less deadly, commanded drone fleets with a flick of her wrist. Their disappearance had been a turning point in the war, a psychological blow that nearly broke Siltheri morale. Now, Torin carried them not just as rescued prisoners of war, but as symbols of something fragile and precious that might still be salvaged from the ashes. He'd spent the last 2 days nursing them with military rations, boiled desert cactus water, and the stubborn will that had kept him alive through a dozen lost battles. He hadn't expected gratitude. He hadn't expected anything. He just knew leaving them to die wasn't an option. Not when the war was over, and not when their eyes, even in unconsciousness, held the same haunted look he saw in his own reflection. The journey back to the Siltheri capital, Jarrail, was a gauntlet of paranoia and desert predators. San Wyramis, drawn by the scent of blood and tech, circled at night. Rogue Krellian stragglers, refusing to accept the truce, ambushed them twice, once near the Bone Canyons, once at the ruins of the Sky Temple of Elthar. Torin fought like a man possessed, his old pulse rifle sparking and sputtering, his body moving on instinct more than strength. The princesses, weak as they were, began to stir by the 3rd day. Lyria woke first, her azure eyes snapping open with the sharpness of a drawn blade. She tried to lunge at him before her body gave out, collapsing back onto the sled with a gasp. "Human!" she hissed in accented Terran, her voice raw but fierce. "You've taken us prisoner." "I found you," Torin corrected, not looking up from the fire he was trying to coax from damp kindling. "Under 50 tons of rubble. You were both fading fast." Silva stirred then, her voice softer, more measured. "Why help us? We are Siltheri, your enemy." Torin finally looked at her, his face smudged with grime, his eyes sunken but steady. "The war's over, and I don't leave people to die in holes." Something flickered in Silva's gaze. Not just suspicion, but something like wonder. Lyria remained distrustful, but even she fell silent after that, watching him with narrowed eyes as he shared his last protein bar between them. By the time they reached the outer gates of Jarrail, the city shimmered like a mirage atop a sea of obsidian cliffs. Towers of living crystal spiraled into the sky, pulsing gently with internal light, their surfaces inlaid with veins of silver that glowed in the setting suns. The Siltheri guards at the gate nearly fainted when they saw the human dragging the royal sled toward them. Weapons were raised, alarms sounded, and within minutes, the entire palace guard was mobilized. Torin dropped his rifle immediately, hands raised, and helped the barely standing princesses off the sled. Lyria leaned heavily on his arm, her pride warring with her weakness, while Silva walked unaided but unsteadily. Then the gates of the inner palace opened, and Empress Nerissa emerged. She was taller than Torin expected, her blue skin etched with the fine silver lines of royal lineage, her white hair braided with mourning cords of obsidian thread. Her armor was ceremonial now, sleek, lightweight, but still unmistakably regal, and her eyes, sharp and ancient, fixed on her daughters with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. She didn't run. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there, statue still, until Lyria whispered, "Mother," and collapsed into her arms. The reunion was a storm of grief and relief. Neressa clutched both her daughters, her voice breaking as she murmured ancient Silthari lullabies, her tears tracing silver paths down her cheeks. Only after a long while did she look up, and her gaze locked onto Torin. The gratitude in her eyes was deep, but so was the caution. A human in the heart of the Silthari capital was unheard of. A human who had saved her children? Unthinkable. "You will be honored," she said, her voice resonant with authority. "Your name will be sung in the halls of return." Torin merely bowed his head. "I'm just glad they made it." Over the next few weeks, Torin was given quarters in the palace. Not as a prisoner, but not quite as a guest, either. The Silthari were gracious but distant, watching him with wary curiosity. Lyria recovered quickly, her fire returning with every passing day. She sparred with the royal guard, drilled cadets, and sometimes sat with Torin in the palace gardens under the twin moons, their conversations starting stiff but growing easier with time. She teased him about his primitive Terran coffee, and he ribbed her about her overly dramatic royal titles. Silva, meanwhile, spent long hours in the data archives, piecing together what had happened during their capture. She discovered encrypted logs suggesting the Krellians had planned to use the princesses as leverage, but the bombardment had disrupted their plans, burying the princesses before they could be moved. One afternoon, as Torin practiced knife throws in the training yard, to the quiet amusement of several Silthari soldiers, Silva approached him with a data slate in hand. Her expression was unreadable. "There's something you should see," she said, "in the royal crypt beneath the palace. A place lit only by the soft blue glow of ancestral crystals." Silva showed him an old Hola recording. It was grainy, decades old, but unmistakable. A younger Empress Neressa standing beside a human man in worn Terran fatigues, their hands clasped, their faces lit with a joy that transcended species. The man's face was lean, serious, with the same stubborn set to his jaw that Torin saw every morning in the mirror. "That's my father," Torin whispered. Silva nodded slowly. His name was Jaren Vale. He was a Terran xenolinguist attached to the early diplomatic mission before the war. "He and our mother, they loved each other, deeply, but the Silthari Council forbade it. Humans were seen as volatile, short-lived. When Mother became heir to the throne, their union was declared invalid. Jaren was sent back to Earth. She never saw him again." Torin's breath caught. "And the princesses?" Silva's voice was barely a whisper. "They didn't know. None of us did. Mother never spoke of him. But the genetic markers, they match. You're not just their rescuer, Torin. You're their half-brother." The revelation struck like a plasma bolt to the chest. Torin staggered back, the world tilting beneath his feet. All those strange moments, the way Silva had looked at him with quiet understanding, the way Lyria's temper flared when he took unnecessary risks, the uncanny familiarity of their mannerisms. It made sense now. They weren't just saved by a stranger. They'd been found by family. He confronted Empress Neressa that evening in the Star Chamber, where the ceiling opened to the endless desert sky. She didn't deny it. Instead, tears welled in her eyes once more. But these were different, older, heavier, carrying the weight of decades of silence. "I thought he was gone from my life forever," she said, her voice trembling. "When I learned he died in the early skirmishes of the war, I buried that part of myself. I never imagined, I never dreamed he had a son, and that you would be the one to bring my daughters home." Torin didn't know what to feel. Anger, sorrow, disbelief. But beneath it all was a strange, swelling warmth. He had grown up fatherless, raised in a military orphanage on Mars after his mother died in childbirth. He'd never known his father's face, only his name and a single faded photo. Now, standing before this alien empress who had loved his father, with two sisters he never knew he had, he felt something shift inside him, a missing piece clicking into place. The days that followed were charged with new meaning. Lyria, once skeptical, now looked at him with a mix of awe and protective fury. "You're telling me I've been arguing with my own brother about tactical formations?" She'd laughed one morning over breakfast. shoving a bowl of spiced grain porridge toward him. "No wonder you're so stubborn." Silva, ever the thinker, began researching Terran customs, trying to understand what it meant to have a sibling. She asked Torin endless questions about human holidays, sibling rivalries, shared memories. He told her about Earth's oceans, its forests, its chaotic cities. She listened with rapt attention, her white hair catching the light like spun moonlight. But peace in the palace was fragile. The truce with the Krellians was unraveling. Reports came in of border skirmishes, stolen supply convoys, and whispers of a new weapon being developed in the dead zones. Worse, factions within the Silthri Council saw Torin's presence as a threat, an outsider too close to the royal family, a human with unknown motives. Some even whispered that he'd staged the rescue to infiltrate the palace. Then came the night of the blood eclipse. Under the twin moon's crimson shadow, assassins struck. Cloaked in phase shrouds, they infiltrated the palace, their goal clear: eliminate the Imperial line before the Krellians launched their final assault. Torin was awakened by the sound of blaster fire. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the royal wing, heart pounding. He found Lyria already in the corridor, fighting 3 assassins with nothing but a ceremonial dagger and pure fury. Silva was barricaded in the data vault, trying to warn allied systems of the incoming Krellian fleet. Torin didn't hesitate. He fired, moved, reloaded, his body remembering every drill, every battle. He took a plasma bolt to the shoulder but kept going, shielding Lyria as she disarmed one assassin with a brutal twist. Together, they fought back to back, human and Silthri, brother and sister, their movements falling into an effortless rhythm that felt both new and ancient. When it was over, the assassins lay dead, and the palace alarms wailed like mourning birds. Empress Neressa, unharmed but shaken, embraced them both in the blood-smeared hallway. "You fight like your father," she told Torin softly. He was brave like this too. The Krellian fleet arrived at dawn. Hundreds of jagged warships descended over the desert, blotting out the suns. The Silthri defenses powered up, their crystal towers humming with stored energy. Torin stood on the palace ramparts beside Lyria and Silva, watching the storm gather. He should have been afraid, but for the first time in his life he wasn't fighting alone. "We don't have to win," Silva said, her fingers flying over a tactical pad. "We just have to hold long enough for the Terran Third Fleet to arrive. They're 8 hours out." 8 hours? Lyria scoffed. "We'll be dust by then." "Not if we use the ether core," Torin said suddenly. They both turned to him. The ether core was the palace's ultimate weapon, a relic from the Age of Harmony, capable of emitting a pulse that could disable all technology in a 100-kilometer radius. But using it would drain the palace's life support, communications, and shields. It was a last resort. "It's suicide," Lyria said. "Only if we stay," Torin replied. "We evacuate the palace, lure the fleet close, then detonate the core from a distance. They'll be blind, floating metal coffins." Silva's eyes lit up. "The Terran fleet can pick them off like sitting ducks." Empress Neressa gave the order without hesitation. The evacuation began immediately. While the Royal Guard held the outer walls, civilians and non-combatants fled into the desert tunnels that led to hidden sanctuaries. Torin, Lyria, and Silva stayed behind, planting time charges near the core chamber. As the Krellian ships descended, unleashing torrents of fire upon the palace, the 3 of them raced to a hidden hangar where a single scout ship waited. The detonation was blinding. A wave of silent blue energy erupted from the heart of Jerael, washing over the desert like a ghost tide. Every Krellian ship went dark, their engines dying mid-descent. Moments later, the Terran Third Fleet emerged from hyperspace, catching the enemy completely off guard. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. In the aftermath, as the desert cooled beneath a sky cleared of warships, Torin stood with his family on a dune overlooking the ruins of the palace. It would be rebuilt, Neressa promised. Stronger, wiser, and this time with open doors. Lyria punched Torin lightly in the arm. "You're stuck with us now, brother." Silva smiled, linking her arm through his. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for." And Empress Neressa, her mourning veils finally removed, looked at her son, the human warrior who had crossed a desert, a war, and a lifetime of silence to bring her daughters home, and saw not an outsider, but the living echo of the man she had never stopped loving. In the months that followed, peace talks began in earnest. Torin, no longer just a soldier but a bridge between 2 worlds, sat at the negotiating table. He learned Silthri customs, taught them Earth games, and once, during a particularly tense session, accidentally set off a fire alarm by trying to brew Terran coffee in a ceremonial energy conduit. Lyria never let him live that down. Silva worked tirelessly to rebuild the data networks, while Lyria trained a new generation of joint Silthri-Terran peacekeepers. And slowly, the scars of war began to heal. Years later, when the new palace was complete, its towers now interwoven with Terran steel and Silthri crystal, Torin stood in the central garden with his wife, a former medic from his old unit who had followed him to Varelli's out of sheer stubborn affection. Around them, children played, some with blue skin and white hair, others with pale Terran complexions, all laughing as they chased bioluminescent desert moths under the twin suns. Lyria's twins, bold little fighters already, raced past, arguing over who got to pilot the hover sled. Silva's daughter, quieter but sharp-eyed, sat under a crystal tree, reading a datapad that contained stories of Earth's oceans. And in the distance, Empress Nerissa watched it all with a serene smile, her hand resting on the carved stone bench where Jaren Vale's name had finally been etched alongside hers. War had taken much, but from its ashes, something unexpected and far more enduring had grown. Not just peace but family, not just survival but belonging. And as Torin lifted his own child onto his shoulders, pointing to the sky where Terran and Silthri ships now flew side by side in silent salute, he knew his father would have been proud. The desert still held its ghosts, but now it also held laughter. And that, more than anything, was victory. Peace, as it turned out, was far more treacherous than war. For 2 years, the fragile alliance between the Terran coalition and the Silthri Dominion held. Trade flourished. Cultural exchanges blossomed. Torin Vale, now formally recognized as Prince Consort of the Silthri royal line, oversaw the construction of the first joint human-alien colony on the verdant moon of Zyra, where blue-skinned children played tag with human toddlers beneath twin suns filtered through alien canopies. Yet beneath the surface, old wounds festered. Not all Silthri accepted a human in their royal bloodline, and not all Terrans trusted their warrior prince loyalties. The first tremor came in the form of a data leak. Classified military schematics of the Ether Core's rebuilt containment system appeared on black market networks across the Outer Rim. The Terran High Command accused Silthri dissidents. The Silthri Council suspected Terran spies. Torin, caught between both worlds, demanded an independent investigation, only to be sidelined when Empress Nerissa, under pressure from hardline ministers, placed the royal guard under strict isolation protocols. Then came the dreams. Silva began waking in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, whispering in a guttural dialect no linguist in the palace could identify. At first, Lyria dismissed it as stress. But when Silva started drawing strange glyphs on the walls of her chamber, symbols that matched ancient Silthri warnings of the sleeper beneath the sand, Torin grew uneasy. He remembered stories from old war briefings, rumors of a pre-collapse biomechanical intelligence buried deep beneath the Varelian wastes, an entity the early Silthri had sealed away after it nearly consumed their civilization. One evening, while reviewing sensor logs from the desert border zones, Torin noticed something impossible. Energy signatures pulsing from the glass wastes, the very site where he'd found the twins. The pulses weren't Krellian. They weren't Terran or Silthri. They were organic yet artificial, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He took a skiff alone, against Lyria's protests, and flew into the wastes under cover of a sandstorm. What he found wasn't ruins. It was a vault, massive, obsidian black, covered in the same glyph Silva had drawn. And it was opening. Inside, suspended in amber fluid within a crystalline pod, floated a being unlike any he'd seen. Tall, slender, with iridescent blue skin darker than Silthri hue, long silver-white hair fused with neural filaments, and eyes closed as if in eternal slumber. But the worst part? The pod bore the insignia of the first Silthri dynasty, and etched beside it, in Terran script, was a name, Project Eos. Torin's blood ran cold. Project Eos had been a Black Ops Terran bioweapons initiative, shut down decades ago after ethical violations. But someone had revived it here on Silthri soil. Before he could transmit his findings, the vault sealed. Lights flared, and the sleeper opened its eyes. It didn't speak. It projected, flooding Torin's mind with visions. A future where the sleeper awakened fully, its consciousness infecting every network, every living mind it touched, turning allies into puppets, love into control. In one vision, Lyria stood atop the palace spire, her eyes glowing with unnatural light, commanding a hybrid army of humans and Silthri to burn Zyra. In another, Silva smiled serenely as she uploaded the sleeper's code into the Ether Core, turning it not into a weapon, but a womb. Torin barely escaped, the vault collapsing behind him as the sleeper's psychic scream tore through the dunes. Back in Jarail, he tried to warn the Empress, but Silva intercepted him. Her demeanor had changed. Calm. Too calm. You saw it, didn't you? She said, her voice soft but distant, as if speaking through water. It doesn't want to destroy us, Torin. It wants to unite us. No more war. No more division. One mind. One will. Horror gripped him. It's in your head. It showed me peace, she whispered. True peace. Lyria refused to believe it at first until Silva, during a council session, recited classified Terran naval codes without ever having access to them. The truth became undeniable. The sleeper was using Silva as a conduit, and it was growing stronger. Worse still, the leak about the ether core? It hadn't come from spies. It came from Silva unknowingly during her trances. The Krellians, desperate and humiliated after their defeat, had allied with a rogue faction of Terran scientists who'd originally created Project Eos. They'd come not to conquer, but to harvest the sleeper, and use it to rewrite all sentient life in their image. The final betrayal came on the night of the Twin Eclipse Festival. The palace glowed with floating lanterns. Torin's children danced with Silva's daughter among the crystal trees. Even Empress Nerissa had joined the celebration, her face alight with rare joy. Then the lights died. Every system in the palace went dark, not from sabotage but from absorption. The ether core, compromised through Silva's silent commands, had begun resonating with the sleeper's frequency. In the central courtyard, Silva rose into the air, her body wreathed in shimmering blue energy, eyes fully silver now, her voice echoing with thousands of harmonized tones. The age of fragmentation ends, she intoned. We ascend together. The sleeper was no longer beneath the sand. It was here. Lyria fought first, charging with her plasma scimitar. But Silva flicked her wrist, and Lyria froze, her limbs locked by invisible force. Torin grabbed his old pulse rifle, but it crumbled to dust in his hands. Technology was being unmade, rewritten. Only one thing remained untouched. The ancient Silthari soul flutes, carved from meteoric bone, used only in mourning rites. Torin remembered his father's journal. Jaren Vale had written about them, calling them resonant anchors of individual will. He sprinted to the ancestral vault, dodging energy tendrils that lashed from the walls like living whips. He grabbed the largest flute and raced back to the courtyard, where Silva now hovered above the ground, her form beginning to dissolve into pure light. You can't stop unity, she said, her voice both hers and not hers. It is evolution. Evolution without choice isn't evolution, Torin shouted. It's extinction. He raised the flute to his lips and played. The note was raw, human, imperfect, a single thread of solitary will in a sea of harmony. First, nothing happened. Then Silva shuddered. A tear traced her cheek. For a split second, her eyes were her own again. Torin, she whispered. Help me. That was all he needed. He poured everything into the melody, memories of Earth's reign. His father's laughter, Lyria's teasing. His children's first steps. The taste of bad Terran coffee in the palace kitchen. It wasn't a weapon. It was a reminder of individuality, of love that chose rather than obeyed. The sleeper recoiled. His control fractured. Lyria broke free and launched herself at Silva, not to strike, but to embrace her. Fight it, sister. You're still in there. The psychic storm raged. The palace trembled. Deep beneath the desert, the vault imploded, collapsing the sleeper's physical form into quantum dust. But its consciousness, now wounded and enraged, lashed out. Not at the palace, but at the nearest vessel of pure will, Torin. It surged into him. Pain unlike anything he'd known tore through his mind. Visions of 1,000 lives, 1,000,000 choices, all collapsing into one. He saw himself ruling a galaxy of obedient minds. He saw himself erasing war by erasing free will. He saw himself as God, and as nothing. But in the chaos, one thought held firm. I choose my family. He didn't resist the sleeper. He invited it in, then trapped it within the only place it couldn't dominate. The messy, illogical, contradictory labyrinth of a human heart. The light vanished. Silva collapsed into Lyria's arms, gasping. Her eyes blew once more. The palace systems rebooted. The stars returned to the sky. Torin stood alone in the center of the courtyard, trembling. He was alive but changed. Flecks of silver now swirled in his irises. And sometimes, in the silence, he heard a whisper that wasn't his own. The sleeper wasn't gone. It was sleeping inside him. In the weeks that followed, Silva underwent neural purification rites, her mind cleansed but forever scarred. Lyria never left her side. Empress Nerissa, shaken but resolute, dissolved the Hardline Council and declared a new era of transparency. The rogue Terran scientists were captured, their Krellian allies routed. But Torin knew the truth. The war wasn't over. It had just moved inward. He began training not with weapons, but with meditation masters from the silent monasteries of the Crimson Peaks. He learned to quiet the whisper, to cage the storm inside. Some nights, he feared he'd lose himself. Other nights, he wondered if the sleeper was learning from him, too, learning what it meant to love, to doubt, to choose. One evening, as he sat with his wife and children in the rebuilt garden, his youngest daughter tugged his sleeve. "Papa, why do your eyes glow when you're sad?" He kissed her forehead. "Because even broken things can hold light, little star." Far away, in the ruins of the glass wastes, something stirred beneath the sand. Not the sleeper but its twin, buried deeper, older, and now awake. Torin felt it in his bones. He smiled grimly, stood, and walked toward the palace armory. Not for a rifle, not for a blade, but for the soul flute. The desert had given him a family. Now it demanded a guardian. And Torin Vale, human, prince, brother, father, an unwilling vessel of an ancient god, was ready. Years passed, and the scars, both seen and unseen, softened into wisdom. Torin never fully rid himself of the sleeper's echo, but he learned to live with it, not as a prisoner or a host, but as a reluctant partner in an uneasy truce. The voice in his mind, once a storm of alien hunger, grew quieter, almost curious. It began to ask questions not about conquest but about stories. Why did humans cry at weddings? Why did Silthari children name their pet sand lizards after philosophers? Slowly, astonishingly, the ancient intelligence began to understand what it had once sought to erase. That true unity wasn't conformity, but the choice to stand together despite difference. And that choice was tested one final time. The twin of the sleeper, a being the ancient Silthari called Nixera, the Hollow Crown, rose from the deepest chasm of the glass wastes during the Great Convergence, when the orbits of Virelis's twin suns aligned perfectly with the moon of Zyra. Nixera didn't seek to merge minds. It sought to unmake them, to dissolve all consciousness back into the primordial silence from which it believed life had mistakenly emerged. Its arrival wasn't heralded by warships, but by silence itself. Entire colonies went mute. Communications failed. Minds simply stopped dreaming. Panic threatened to fracture the fragile peace Torin had spent years building. But this time, no one looked to weapons first. Lyria, now High Commander of the Unified Defense Accord, rallied joint human Silthari battalions, but not to fight. She positioned them as shields, not swords, protecting evacuation routes and neural sanctuaries where elders and children could be shielded by harmonic resonance fields. Silva, healed and wiser, coordinated with Terran scientists and Silthari mystics to weave a counterfrequency. A song of memory, not power, designed not to destroy Nixera, but to remind it that existence, however painful, was worth preserving. And Torin walked into the storm alone. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried the soul flute, and a small data crystal containing recordings of 1,000 voices. His daughter's first laugh, Lyria's battle cry turned lullaby, Silva reciting poetry under the stars, Empress Nerissa singing the old morning songs with new words of hope, even the gruff voice of his old sergeant from the 7th, now farming on Zyra, telling a joke about malfunctioning coffee bots. At the edge of the hollow crown silence, Torin played. The flute's note was thin at first, almost swallowed by the void. But then, from the evacuation zones, others joined. Silthari choirs in crystal amphitheaters. Terran children in makeshift shelters tapping rhythms on ration tins. Elders humming ancestral tunes. Even the ether core, recalibrated not as a weapon but as an amplifier, pulsed with harmonic resonance. Nixera hesitated. Torin stepped forward, eyes glowing silver blue, voice calm. "You think silence is peace," he said, the sleeper's voice now harmonizing with his own, not in domination, but in duet. "But peace is the space between notes. It's the breath before a kiss, the pause before a promise. You don't need to unmake us to find rest. You just need to listen." For the first time in millennia, Nixera listened, and in the chorus of 1,000 imperfect, joyful, grieving, loving voices, the hollow crown remembered what it had forgotten. That even silence has shape, only because sound gave it meaning. It didn't vanish. transformed. Its energy diffused into the planet itself, weaving into the magnetic fields, the winds, the roots of the crystal trees, becoming not a destroyer, but a guardian of quietude, a keeper of the spaces between. The silence lifted. Life returned. Not as it was, but as it could be. Deeper, more aware, more tender. In the aftermath, Torin stood with his family on the balcony of the new palace, watching the twin suns set over a desert now blooming with bioluminescent flora. Gifts from Zyra, planted in memory of the silence that taught them to speak more kindly. Lyria leaned against the railing, her armor retired, replaced by the robes of a peace envoy. She'd adopted 3 orphaned Krellian children and taught them Silthari sword forms not for war, but for discipline and grace. Silva, now archivist of shared memory, had opened the first interstellar library on Zyra, where human folktales sat beside Silthari epics, and children from a dozen species learned to read in multiple tongues. Empress Nerissa had abdicated not from weakness, but from trust. She passed the crown to Lyria and Silva jointly, declaring that the future of the Dominion would be shaped by both heart and mind. Her final act as Empress? Officially adopting Torin not just as son, but as Kaelinvor, heart-brother of the realm. A title never before given to any human. Torin's wife, Mara, rested her head on his shoulder. Their children, 5 in all, 3 with her warm brown skin and his stubborn chin, 2 with blue-tinged cheeks and silver-streaked hair, raced across the garden, playing a game that mixed Terran tag with Silthari light-chasing rituals. Inside the palace, the grand hall buzzed with life. Diplomats from a dozen worlds shared meals. Former enemies debated philosophy over steaming mugs of Terran coffee, now brewed safely in ceramic pots. Lyria always joked. And in a quiet corner, an old soul flute rested on a velvet cushion, no longer a weapon, but a relic of salvation. Torin never became king. He never sought power, but he became something rarer, a bridge that held. And on the night of his 50th birthday, as fireworks painted the sky in hues of blue and gold, his youngest daughter, now a teenager with his crooked smile and Silva's thoughtful eyes, asked him if he ever regretted walking into the wastes all those years ago. He looked at his family, at the palace alive with laughter, at the desert now dotted with gardens and schools and homes shared by humans and Silthari alike, and he smiled. "I regret nothing," he said, "because every step led me here, to you." Years later, when Torin and Mara grew old, they built a small home on the edge of the glass wastes, not far from where it all began. The desert was green now, thanks to atmospheric receders and patient hands. Their grandchildren, dozens of them, from every blend of blood and star, visited often, bringing stories, songs, and badly baked cakes. The sleeper never spoke again, but sometimes on quiet nights, the wind would hum a familiar tune, and Torin would smile, knowing he was not alone. When he finally passed, it was peacefully. In his sleep, Mara's hand in his, the twin suns rising over a world he helped heal. He was buried not in a tomb, but beneath a crystal tree in the palace garden. And every year, on the anniversary of the Twin Eclipse Festival, people from every world would gather there. Not to mourn, but to play music, share stories, and remember that sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't those who win wars, but those who build homes from the ashes. Lyria and Silva ruled wisely for decades, their bond unbreakable. The Dominion thrived, not as an empire, but as a family of worlds. And the name Torin Vale became more than a legend. It became a promise. That compassion could cross species, that blood could mean more than biology, and that even in the darkest desert, love could plant a garden. And so, in the end, they did not just survive. They flourished. They loved. They raised children who never knew war. And that, more than crowns, more than victories, was the happiest ending of all.